Aston Martin may have just taken the single biggest step of its entire 2026 Formula One recovery plan. And the most interesting part is that we still have not seen the new package at a proper Grand Prix weekend. Honda has now physically installed its upgraded power unit into Aston Martin's B-Spec AMR26 for the first time, using a filming day as a crucial shakedown before the engine makes its expected competitive debut at Zandvoort. And this is not simply another routine engine test. Behind this quiet run is a much bigger story involving horsepower, electrical performance, reliability, weight reduction, Adrian Newey's development philosophy, and Aston Martin's increasingly ambitious plan for the remainder of 2026 and beyond. The team that spent the first half of the season struggling at the very back of the Formula One field has suddenly produced a car that looked dramatically more competitive in Hungary, and now Honda is preparing to add the missing piece. So the obvious question is this: how much faster can Aston Martin actually become when the upgraded Honda power unit is combined with the B-Spec chassis? And could this be the moment when the team finally stops looking like a struggling backmarker and starts looking like a serious midfield contender? Before we get to the engine numbers, there is an important detail from the days leading into this test that tells us just how carefully Aston Martin has been managing this entire transformation. On Tuesday, the team did not immediately put the new B-Spec car on track. Instead, Jack Crawford drove the older AMR26 during a Pirelli tire test. At first glance, that might have looked strange. Why would Aston Martin choose to run an older, visibly slower specification of the car immediately before introducing its biggest technical upgrade of the season? The answer is actually quite logical. Pirelli was collecting information for the development of the 2027 tires, and an older, lower downforce Formula One car can provide useful data for that program. The older AMR26 also happened to be available at the circuit, meaning Aston Martin could gather additional running without sacrificing the opportunity to prepare the new specification. In other words, Tuesday was about data collection and keeping options open, while Wednesday was the important day for Honda. The upgraded power unit was always expected to be the headline act, and this is where the story becomes much more interesting. Aston Martin has already completed a huge transformation of its chassis. The Hungarian Grand Prix brought no fewer than 16 declared updates to the AMR26, including major aerodynamic revisions and significant work aimed at reducing the car's weight. Honda's upgraded power unit was then scheduled as the next major step, giving Aston Martin something it desperately needed: more performance from both sides of the car at the same time. And that distinction matters because Aston Martin's problems in 2026 have never been purely about horsepower. The electrical side of Honda's new generation power unit has been one of the biggest weaknesses in the partnership. Energy deployment, hybrid performance, and the way the system delivers power have all created problems that have cost the team performance throughout the season. That means Honda's latest development is not simply a case of opening up the combustion engine and searching for a few extra horsepower. The electrical side of the package is also a major focus, and that could ultimately be just as important as the headline engine output. The Hungarian upgrade already demonstrated that the Aston Martin chassis had much more potential than its first half-season results suggested. The team arrived at the Hungaroring with an extensively revised car, and although it was still far from perfectly optimized, the performance gain was obvious. Aston Martin had spent months holding back development while preparing this major package, and the result was a car that could finally fight with cars it had previously been nowhere near. Official Formula One reporting described the Hungarian weekend as a clear step forward, with Aston Martin jumping several rivals after having been cut adrift at the back earlier in the year. That is why the Honda engine matters so much now. Imagine having a chassis that is already showing a substantial improvement, while simultaneously knowing that the power unit responsible for one of the car's biggest weaknesses is about to receive a major revision. That is the combination Aston Martin has been waiting for. And there is another important piece of the puzzle: weight. The B-Spec AMR26 has shed a meaningful amount of mass, bringing the car closer to the FIA minimum weight requirement. Honda's own information confirms that weight reduction was one of the central objectives of the revised Aston Martin package. In Formula One, reducing weight is one of the most valuable forms of performance because it does not depend on finding a new aerodynamic trick or discovering some revolutionary suspension concept. Every kilogram removed can improve acceleration, braking, tire performance, and overall responsiveness. Aston Martin still has more weight to remove, but the direction of development is clearly positive. And that is where Adrian Newey becomes such an important part of this story. The Hungarian package was not designed to completely reinvent the fundamental architecture of the AMR26. Instead, Aston Martin focused on improving the aerodynamic efficiency of the existing concept, strengthening the floor performance, revising the airflow around the car, and reducing weight. Honda's official technical description confirms that the chassis and gearbox retained their basic architecture, while extensive aerodynamic refinements and weight reduction formed the heart of the major package. This is important because it means Aston Martin is not throwing away everything it built during the first half of the year. It is learning from the problems and gradually moving the car toward the characteristics Newey believes can produce performance. The team has also been examining the rake and underfloor behavior of the car, with the revised package designed to support stronger diffuser performance and more consistent aerodynamic behavior. Now add the new Honda power unit to that equation, and suddenly the potential becomes much more exciting. There have been different estimates circulating about how much horsepower the upgraded Honda engine can deliver. Some reports have suggested a gain in the region of 35 horsepower, while other estimates have pointed towards something closer to 40 or even 50 horsepower. At this stage, it would be irresponsible to present any one of those numbers as an official figure because Honda has not publicly confirmed an exact horsepower gain. The safer conclusion is that Aston Martin is expecting a meaningful performance increase, and even a gain somewhere around the lower end of those estimates could have a significant impact on lap time. More importantly, Honda has been working on the internal architecture of the power unit as well. Reports have highlighted changes involving the Prix chamber, piston, and combustion chamber, while reliability has been one of the central engineering challenges. That is a crucial point. Making an engine faster is one thing. Making it faster while ensuring it survives an entire race weekend is something completely different. Every extra unit of combustion pressure, every increase in thermal load, and every aggressive change to the engine's internal geometry creates additional engineering challenges. Honda therefore needs to prove that the performance gain is not coming at the cost of reliability. And that is precisely why the filming day was so important. The run was not simply about creating promotional footage. It was an opportunity to put the new hardware through a controlled shakedown, collect data, and confirm that the systems are behaving as expected before the engine is pushed into a full Grand Prix weekend. With modern Formula One testing restrictions, every legal kilometer becomes extremely valuable. Aston Martin cannot simply spend several weeks privately testing the new engine until every problem disappears. The team has to make every available opportunity count. That is why the timing of this run is so significant. The engineers can now take the information from the filming day, compare it with simulations and dyno data, and arrive at Zandvoort with a much clearer understanding of how the power unit should be operated. And if the correlation is strong, Aston Martin could gain another advantage: setup confidence. This was one of the biggest challenges with the B-spec chassis in Hungary. The car was new, the aerodynamic behavior was different, and the team had only a limited amount of running to understand it. Aston Martin effectively had to learn the new car while competing. That is not an easy task. Yet despite that limited preparation, the team still showed clear progress. Formula One's own analysis described Hungary as a major improvement, while Adrian Newey stressed that the team's immediate objective was simply to get back to a respectable level of competitiveness. Now the engineers have actual track data. They know more about the floor. They know more about the aerodynamic balance. They have a better understanding of tire behavior. And now they are adding a new power unit to that equation. Zandvoort, therefore, becomes a completely different kind of test. Hungary gave Aston Martin an opportunity to demonstrate that the chassis could improve. Zandvoort will begin to answer whether the chassis and Honda engine can work together as a complete package. The Dutch circuit is not identical to the Hungarian. It places different demands on the car, mixes high-speed and medium-speed corners, and can expose weaknesses that a more forgiving circuit may hide. That means the stopwatch at Zandvoort will tell us much more than any optimistic estimate from the factory. If Aston Martin suddenly gains significant straight-line performance while maintaining the cornering improvement it demonstrated in Hungary, then the entire competitive picture changes. But there are still questions. Reliability remains one of them. Another is how much performance Aston Martin can extract from the B-spec chassis before the end of the season. The Hungarian package was only the beginning. Adrian Newey has already indicated that additional upgrades are coming, with Zandvoort and Baku among the important future races for development. That means the team is not simply waiting to see what happens with Honda. It is continuing to develop the car around the new power unit. Further work is expected in areas such as the floor, rear-end airflow, suspension behavior, and other aerodynamic components. The philosophy is clear. Extract more performance from the chassis while Honda removes the power deficit. And that combination could be far more powerful than either upgrade working alone. Think about it this way. If the chassis gains a few tenths through better aerodynamic efficiency, weight reduction, and setup optimization, and the engine adds another significant chunk of performance on the straights, the total improvement becomes much larger than any single upgrade suggests. That is why Aston Martin's recovery should not be judged by one number. It should be judged by the trajectory. Hungary showed that the car can move forward. The Honda test should tell us whether the power unit can finally match that progress. Zandvoort should then reveal whether the two sides of the project are beginning to operate as one coherent package. And if that happens, the targets for the remainder of 2026 suddenly become much more interesting. Could Aston Martin become the fifth fastest team on certain circuits? Could it regularly fight for points rather than relying on chaos and penalties? Could it occasionally challenge teams much further up the order? Those possibilities are no longer completely unrealistic, but they depend heavily on circuit characteristics. Some tracks will naturally suit the Aston Martin more than others. High downforce venues could be particularly interesting because Newey's aerodynamic philosophy is built around extracting performance from exactly those types of environments. Singapore, for example, could become a fascinating test of how far the B-spec car has progressed. At the same time, power-sensitive tracks, such as Monza, will put more pressure on Honda to demonstrate that its upgraded engine really has solved the weaknesses that have hurt Aston Martin throughout the season. Baku could sit somewhere in between, presenting a mixture of long straights and demanding corners. This is why the upcoming races matter so much. Each one will answer a different question about the AMR26. Zandvoort will tell us about the engine and overall integration. Baku will test the balance between aerodynamic efficiency and power. Monza will put the Honda power unit under even greater pressure. And later season circuits could reveal just how much additional performance Aston Martin can unlock once the engineers have several races of data behind them. But perhaps the biggest story is actually 2027. Aston Martin is not developing this project in isolation. The lessons learned from the 2026 power unit, particularly the problems with electrical performance, packaging, reliability, and energy deployment, are feeding directly into Honda's future development work. The same is true for the chassis. Every kilogram removed, every aerodynamic weakness discovered, and every correlation problem solved this year gives the team information that can be carried into the next generation. This is why the current season cannot simply be written off as a failure. Yes, the start has been disastrous by Aston Martin's own standards. Yes, the team spent much of the year fighting at the back. But the second half of the season can serve as a live development program for a much bigger project. And that is exactly why Newey's presence matters. He is not simply trying to rescue a few points in 2026. He is trying to establish a technical direction that can make Aston Martin a serious force under the new regulations. Fernando Alonso's role is equally important. A driver with his experience can identify problems that numbers alone do not always explain. If Alonso is increasingly positive about the direction of the car, that matters because he has spent decades learning the difference between genuine performance and a car that only looks good on a timing sheet under certain conditions. Aston Martin still has a huge amount to prove, but there are now signs that the pieces are beginning to move in the right direction. And Honda deserves credit for taking the risk of pushing the power unit forward rather than simply accepting the performance deficit. The key word, however, is reliability. Until the upgraded engine completes a full race weekend under competitive conditions, we simply will not know whether Honda has solved the problem or merely moved it somewhere else. That is the question Zandvoort will answer. The horsepower figures can create headlines. The simulations can create excitement. The technical promises can generate optimism. But Formula One ultimately comes down to one thing: lap time under real racing conditions. If the Honda engine delivers the expected step if the B-Spec chassis continues to improve, and if Aston Martin can remove more weight while refining the setup, the team could be looking at one of the most dramatic second-half recoveries of the season. Not a championship-winning transformation overnight, and certainly not a guarantee of regular podiums, but a genuine move from the back of the field toward the competitive midfield. And that would be a massive achievement considering where this team started. The most important thing to remember is that the Aston Martin we saw before Hungary is not the Aston Martin we are going to see for the rest of this season. The 16-update B-Spec package was only the first major stage. Honda's new power unit is the next. More aerodynamic development is coming. More weight reduction is coming. More data is coming. And perhaps most importantly, the team now has a clearer understanding of what actually works. That changes the entire development process. Instead of trying random solutions, Aston Martin can build on a foundation that has finally shown evidence of producing performance. So now the question is no longer whether Aston Martin has improved. We already know it has. The real question is how far this recovery can go. Can Honda finally give Newey the power unit performance he needs? Can Aston Martin turn its 1.5-second style chassis improvement into something even bigger through optimization? Can the team break into the top 5 on the right circuits? And could this late-season surge become the foundation for a much more dangerous Aston Martin in 2027? We are about to find out. Zandvoort is the first major checkpoint, and the new Honda engine will be under the microscope from the moment the car leaves the garage. If the numbers match the expectations, Aston Martin's entire 2026 story could change in a matter of one weekend. After months of frustration, the team finally has momentum. Now Honda has to prove that the engine can turn that momentum into real performance. And if it can, Aston Martin may have finally stopped fighting simply to escape the back of the grid and started fighting for something much bigger. The comeback has begun. The only question now is how far Adrian Newey, Fernando Alonso, Aston Martin and Honda can take it before the checkered flag falls on 2026.